The lantern light flickered against the brick walls. Shadows moved fast, too fast. Hours earlier, this courtyard echoed with routine commands. Now it echoed with groans. A guard tore down a notice board to use as a splint. A prisoner held a stranger's hand, whispering words in a language neither fully understood. A bell rang, not for roll call. For help. Somewhere beyond the wire, distant thunder rolled. Or was it artillery? No one could tell anymore. The wind carried the smell of burning timber from the nearby town. Inside the camp, hunger had already been a constant companion. Now fear joined it. A medic knelt on the cold stone and realized something chilling. There were more wounded arriving. From where? The gates had not officially opened. Footsteps pounded toward the entrance. A whispered order passed between guards. Papers were hastily shoved into a coat pocket. A logbook disappeared from the office desk. And then came the decision. We used the courtyard. No meeting, no vote. Just survival. But why here, why now, and who gave the order that changed everything before dawn? The answer begins years earlier, long before the stretchers covered the stones. It was 1944. The war had shifted. Across Europe, prison camps held thousands, captured soldiers, displaced civilians, forced laborers. Among them were facilities like Stalag Luft III and others scattered across occupied territory, designed for containment, not care. This particular camp sat on the edge of a railway junction. Trains passed day and night, supplies came irregularly, news came in whispers. Rules were strict. Roll call at dawn. Rations at noon. Lights out at dusk. Medical care was minimal. A small infirmary existed, 6 beds, 1 cabinet of supplies, 2 trained medics among hundreds of prisoners. The assumption was simple: this camp was temporary. But by late 1944, nothing was temporary anymore. Bombing raids intensified, rail lines became targets, refugees moved in waves, nearby towns were struck repeatedly. Every explosion shook the camp windows. One evening, a guard was seen arguing with an officer near the gate, voices low, urgent. A map unfolded, then folded again quickly when prisoners looked too long. Later that night, a train stopped unexpectedly on the siding. It wasn't scheduled. No explanation followed. And in the infirmary logbook, 1 page from that week would later be found torn out. Why? There was Carl Weiss, a captured field medic in his early 30s. Before the war, he had worked in a rural clinic. Inside the camp, he improvised with scraps, boiling cloth for sterilization, carving splints from crate wood. He believed in routine. Routine meant stability. Then there was Sergeant Miller, one of the guards, tired eyes, thinner each week. Letters from home had stopped arriving months earlier. He enforced rules, but sometimes looked the other way when prisoners traded bread. And Anna Petrov, a displaced civilian temporarily housed in a holding section after her village was destroyed. She spoke little, watched everything. On most days, life in the camp followed predictable rhythms, but small cracks were forming. A crate labeled medical supplies arrived, half empty. A guard tower reported lights flickering beyond the rail yard at midnight. Anna once noticed a group of officers measuring the courtyard with quiet precision. Measuring it for what? Carl sensed tension rising. Requests for additional bandages were denied, yet more stretchers were quietly delivered and stacked near storage. For training drills, they were told. But no drills were scheduled. And one afternoon, Sergeant Miller asked Carl a strange question. If we needed space, how fast could you treat 50? Carl laughed nervously. He never answered. The week before the transformation, silence became heavier. No trains for 2 days. Then 3 in one night. Smoke lingered over the rail yard long after sunrise. A guard returned from town with ash on his coat sleeve. He refused to explain. The infirmary filled beyond capacity. Carl noticed something disturbing. The injuries were different. Not camp-related illness, not malnutrition alone. Blast injuries. Shrapnel wounds. From outside, someone was being brought in quietly, after dark. One evening, Anna heard muffled wheels crossing stone, not the usual ration cart. A stretcher passed her window, then another. She counted 6. By midnight 12. But official records still showed only 6 beds occupied. Where were they putting the rest? A door creaked open in the administration office long after curfew. Papers rustled, a heated whisper, then the sound of a match striking, as if something was being burned. The courtyard lamps were tested that same night. All of them. Why illuminate a space meant to be dark? It began with the explosion. Not inside the camp, but close enough to rattle every window. The rail junction had been struck during a night raid. A munitions car ignited. Civilians and workers were caught in the blast zone. The town clinic collapsed. Roads were blocked with debris. Within hours, survivors needed treatment. The nearest enclosed space with lighting, water access, and guard perimeter. The camp. Orders arrived abruptly. Trucks approached under darkness. Not with soldiers, with injured railway workers, civilians, even off-duty guards caught in the blast. The infirmary overflowed in minutes. Carl stood frozen. Then he heard the words. Use the courtyard. Tables dragged across stone, blankets spread, lanterns hung from window ledges. Prisoners and guards worked side by side, not from unity, but necessity. Someone fainted from smoke inhalation. Someone else kept asking for a child who wasn't there. Bandages ran out within the first hour. A ration sack was torn open for cloth. Water buckets emptied faster than they could be refilled. And amid the chaos, one detail stood out. No official documentation was being written. Why not? By 3:00 a.m., the courtyard held over 60 wounded. At dawn, it looked nothing like a prison yard. It looked like a field hospital. By morning, higher command arrived. They surveyed the scene in silence. Questions were asked, but softly. Why were civilians inside a military camp? Who authorized the transport? Why was the town clinic unavailable? Sergeant Miller avoided eye contact. Carl continued stitching wounds without pause. Anna carried water until her hands blistered. Later that day, a directive was issued, no mention of the incident in standard logs. Temporary emergency measure, they called it. Yet supplies began arriving, real medical supplies this time. Maury cots. Maury stretchers. Almost as if the transformation was not temporary after all. But when journalists from a neutral delegation requested a visit weeks later, they were shown only the original infirmary. The courtyard was spotless again. As if nothing had happened. Except the stones had changed color. By the time the courtyard returned to silence, the official story was already settled. Emergency overflow, nothing more. But the details refused to sit quietly. And when details refuse to sit quietly, history begins to whisper. Let's examine what might really have happened that night. The most straightforward explanation is also the most human. The rail junction was bombed, the town clinic collapsed, civilians and railway workers were critically injured. The camp, like many wartime detention facilities such as Stalag Luft III, was one of the few enclosed spaces nearby with lighting, guards, and water access. In a crisis, structure matters. The infirmary was too small. 6 beds could not hold 60 wounded. The courtyard was open, flat, and centrally located. It could be illuminated from surrounding buildings. Guards could maintain order. So the commandant made a rapid decision. Use the yard. From this perspective, everything makes sense. The stretchers, the lanterns, the cooperation between prisoners and guards, war blurs lines, survival overrides protocol. But here, what complicates that explanation? If it was only an emergency measure, why were courtyard lamps tested days earlier? Why were extra stretchers delivered before the bombing? And why was a page removed from the infirmary logbook? Emergencies create chaos, not pre-measured dimensions. So was it truly spontaneous? Or partially anticipated? By late 1944, bombing campaigns had intensified across rail networks. Camps near junctions were increasingly exposed. Commanders knew that infrastructure collapse meant civilian overflow. Perhaps the courtyard transformation was not sudden, but accelerated. Anna had seen officers measuring the stone ground. Carl noticed supply crates labeled medical arriving half full, as if diverted. Sergeant Miller's strange question lingered. If we needed space, how fast could you treat 50? 50, not 6. That number wasn't random. What if higher command expected a mass casualty event? What if contingency planning was underway, but quietly, to avoid panic among prisoners? The lamps tested. The stretchers stacked. The logs reviewed. All before the explosion. If this theory holds, then the bombing didn't create the hospital. It triggered a plan already waiting. But here, the tension. If the camp anticipated mass casualties, why didn't they reinforce the infirmary instead? Why choose an exposed courtyard instead of expanding indoor wards? Unless the goal wasn't long-term care. Unless it was temporary triage, meant to stabilize and transfer. But transfer to where? No transport records from the following morning survive. Another possibility is less medical and more political. Wartime leadership understood perception. Allowing civilians to be treated inside a detention camp could serve a purpose. It could demonstrate controlled compassion, order amid destruction, humanity amid conflict. If word spread that camp staff saved railway workers and townspeople, it could strengthen morale locally, perhaps even influence external observers. But this theory fractures when we consider one detail. Weeks later, when neutral delegates requested inspection access, they were shown only the original infirmary, not the courtyard. Why hide the very act that might improve reputation? Unless the courtyard revealed something inconsistent with official standards. Or someone among the wounded should not have been there. Which leads to the next possibility. Among the injured transporting that night, most were civilians and rail workers. Most. But Carl later mentioned, in a post-war interview decades later, that one stretcher was handled differently, surrounded by 2 officers, shielded from view. No uniform visible, no identification announced. That patient was placed not in the center of the courtyard, but near the administrative building. And just before dawn, that stretcher disappeared. No discharge recorded. No burial listed. No transfer documented. Coincidentally or not, that same week, one page from the infirmary log vanished. What if the Courtyard Hospital was not only about mass casualties? What if it was about providing urgent, discreet treatment to someone important caught in the blast, an intelligence officer, a visiting official, a railway strategist? Treating such a figure in town might expose vulnerability. Bringing them inside the camp provided security and control. If true, then the chaos of 60 wounded civilians created perfect cover. But here's the counterpoint. No surviving documents confirm this. Only absence. And absence is not proof. There's one more angle rarely discussed. For one night, prisoners and guards worked side by side. Prisoners held surgical tools, managed supplies, controlled water distribution. In chaos, authority shifts. What if the Courtyard Hospital wasn't just a response to bombing, but also an unspoken negotiation? Carl later recalled that additional food rations appeared in the weeks following the incident. Slightly larger portions, improved medical shipments. Small changes. What if the prisoners' competence that night altered internal dynamics? If they saved civilian lives, command may have owed them something, even if unofficially. But that theory challenges the rigid hierarchy camps were built upon. Would leadership risk empowering detainees, even temporarily? And if so, would they document it? Or erase it? The documentation is incomplete. A torn logbook page. No casualty list from the courtyard. No formal order authorizing civilian entry. No transport records the following morning. War destroys paper, that is true. But selective destruction feels different. It feels deliberate. And yet there is no single definitive answer. Was it improvisation? Preparation? Political maneuvering? A concealed VIP? A A silent shift in power. Each explanation fits, partially. Each leaves something unresolved. Which one aligns with the strange measurements? With the vanished stretcher? With the erased log? History sometimes speaks loudly. Other times it leaves us with a stone courtyard, scrubbed clean before sunrise. So which version do you believe? Because the final piece of this story brings us back to the sound that opened this video. The lantern falling. And what happened just seconds before it hit the ground. By morning, the courtyard looked organized. Too organized. Stretchers aligned in rows, buckets stacked neatly against the wall, lanterns extinguished but still warm. The chaos of the night had been compressed into something that almost resembled routine. Almost. The wounded who could walk were gone by midday, transferred, they were told, to where no one clarified. Those who couldn't walk remained under guard, quieter now. Exhaustion had replaced panic. Carl finally sat down. His hands were trembling. Not from fear, from stillness. When noise stops suddenly, it leaves a ringing behind. He could still hear it, the overlapping voices, the boots running across stone, the sharp crack of the explosion miles away that somehow felt inches from his chest. Sergeant Miller stood near the gate, staring at the courtyard as if memorizing it. Ash still clung to the hem of his coat. He lit a cigarette, then crushed it out halfway through. Anna washed blood from the stones with water that had already turned grey. She scrubbed slowly, methodically, as if cleaning could restore the space to what it had been. But stone remembers pressure, even when it looks clean. By afternoon, an order circulated quietly. Return the courtyard to standard configuration. Tables were removed, blankets folded, crates stacked away. The notice board, the one broken for a splint, was replaced with a fresh sheet listing rations and regulations. Roll call resumed at dusk. Names echoed again in disciplined rhythm. As if the night had been a rumor. But something had shifted. Prisoners who once avoided eye contact with guards now carried the memory of shared labor. Guards who once barked commands had seen prisoners hold bleeding civilians steady with steady hands. For a few hours, hierarchy had thinned under necessity. No one mentioned it directly. Yet the silence felt different. Weeks later, the courtyard stones showed faint discolorations that rain could not entirely erase. Visitors never noticed. Inspectors never asked. Official reports described minor structural impact near rail junction and temporary medical overflow managed internally. Temporary. That word again. Carl would later say that what haunted him most was not the injuries, not the smoke, not the exhaustion. It was the moment before the first stretcher entered the gate. The pause, the hesitation. Someone had stood just inside the entrance and asked quietly, "Are we allowed to do this?" And someone else had answered, "We don't have a choice." That was the true transformation. Not the stretchers. Not the lanterns. Not even the wounded. It was the decision to break the boundary between containment and care. A prison yard exists to control. A hospital exists to save. For one night, those two purposes collided on the same stone floor. And then, by dawn, the boundary was rebuilt. Or was it? Because here is the question that still lingers. If the Courtyard Hospital was only an emergency measure, why were preparations visible days before the blast? Why was a logbook page removed? Why did one stretcher leave before sunrise without record? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all. What happened in the few seconds before the lantern fell, the moment that triggered the rush, the shouting, the sudden decision? Was it panic? Or recognition? We may never know. The courtyard still stands today, quiet, ordinary, unremarkable to the casual eye. But beneath its calm surface lies a memory of a night when structure bent under pressure, when enemies worked side by side, and when survival rewrote the rules without asking permission. History often records battles and treaties. It rarely records improvisation at 3 a.m. So I'll leave you with this. Was the transformation of that courtyard an act of compassion? A calculated contingency? or a cover for something we were never meant to see? Tell me your theory in the comments. And if stories like this, where small decisions echo louder than explosions, matter to you, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and share the video. Because sometimes the quietest places hold the loudest truths.